Ladies and gentlemen, today I stand before you to reflect on a significant chapter in history, the rise of the British Empire in India. This was not an overnight event, but a slow, strategic process that transformed a nation rich in culture and resources into a colony under foreign rule. It all began with trade. In the early 1600s, a trading company arrived on Indian shores with one primary objective: commerce. What began as a simple exchange of goods soon grew into a complex web of political and military ambition. With the establishment of trading posts across coastal regions, they laid the foundation of their influence. During the 18th century, India was in a state of turmoil. The once mighty Mughal Empire was weakening, and local rulers were locked in constant conflict. Seeing an opportunity, the British stepped in, not as mere traders, but as power brokers. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 became a turning point. With a combination of military strength and clever alliances, they seized control of Bengal, gaining a crucial stronghold. But how did they expand beyond that? Their strategy was both calculated and ruthless. They played Indian rulers against each other, using a tactic known as divide and rule. This approach deepened rivalries and prevented unity against a common adversary. The British also introduced policies like the Subsidiary Alliance and the Doctrine of Lapse, which allowed them to extend their power without open warfare. Economic exploitation followed swiftly. Wealth flowed out of India to fuel the empire's ambitions abroad. Traditional industries collapsed, and farmers were burdened under harsh taxes. Meanwhile, the British military, equipped with advanced weapons and well-trained forces, overwhelmed the fragmented armies of local rulers. Yet, the people of India did not remain silent. In 1857, a powerful uprising shook the foundations of British rule. Soldiers, farmers, and common citizens joined hands in what became the First War of Independence. Though this revolt was ultimately suppressed, it marked the beginning of a long and determined struggle for freedom. By 1858, India was no longer under the control of a trading company, but had become a prized possession of the British Crown. What started as a quest for commerce had transformed into an empire built on control, coercion, and the exploitation of an entire subcontinent. Let us remember that this history is not just a tale of conquest, it is a reminder of resilience. The story of how the British Empire took over India is also the story of how a nation endured, resisted, and eventually reclaimed its rightful place in the world. The roots of British dominance in India can be traced back to the early 17th century, when a group of English merchants sought to expand their nation's influence across the world through maritime trade. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to the British East India Company, giving it the exclusive right to trade with the East. This charter not only empowered the company to engage in commerce, but also allowed it to establish forts, raise armies, and negotiate treaties, powers that would eventually pave the way for territorial control. At the time, India was a land of immense wealth and cultural richness. Spices, textiles, and precious gems attracted European powers, including the Portuguese, Dutch, and French. The British, through the East India Company, entered this competitive arena with the goal of securing a share of these lucrative resources. Their initial focus was on establishing trade routes and gaining access to Indian goods that were in high demand across Europe. The company's first major foothold came in 1612 when it secured permission from the Mughal Emperor Jahangir to establish a trading post in Surat, a bustling port city on the western coast of India. This marked the beginning of a slow but deliberate expansion. Over the next few decades, the British established additional trading posts, most notably in Madras, Chennai, in 1639, Bombay, Mumbai, in 1668, and Calcutta, Kolkata, in 1690. These three centers, known as the presidencies, became the pillars of British commercial and military power in India. The company's approach was initially diplomatic. British agents skillfully negotiated with local rulers and the Mughal administration, promising mutual economic benefits. They portrayed themselves as mere traders with no political ambitions, thus securing valuable trading privileges and protection. These agreements allowed the company to fortify its settlements, maintain private armies, and manage its affairs independently. However, behind this facade of peaceful commerce lay a far more ambitious agenda, the desire to dominate not only trade, but also the political landscape of India. The British East India Company was not merely a business entity. It functioned like a state within a state. It had its own administrative structure, a private military, and a vast network of spies and informants. This allowed the company to exert significant influence over local politics. In regions where local rulers were weak or embroiled in conflict, the company took advantage by offering military assistance in return for trading rights and territorial concessions. Another factor that contributed to the company's growing power was the decline of the Mughal Empire. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the once mighty empire was fragmenting due to internal conflicts, succession crises, and economic decay. This decline created a power vacuum, which the British were quick to exploit. While the Mughals remained in control on paper, their authority over vast regions of India weakened, allowing ambitious European powers to step in and assert their dominance. The British East India Company's early years in India were marked by a careful balancing act. They were cautious not to provoke the Mughal Empire while steadily expanding their commercial and military presence. They established their own fortified settlements and began to develop infrastructure that would later become crucial in their efforts to control larger territories. The company also maintained a disciplined and well-trained military force, including both British officers and Indian soldiers, known as sepoys. This standing army would later play a critical role in the company's territorial conquests. By the beginning of the 18th century, the British East India Company had transformed from a trading organization into a formidable political and military power. What started as a pursuit of spices and textiles soon evolved into a calculated campaign to establish and expand British dominance over one of the richest and most diverse regions in the world. This phase of British entry into India laid the foundation for the empire's eventual control over the subcontinent, forever altering the course of Indian history. The establishment of trading posts by the British East India Company was a crucial step in the gradual takeover of India. What began as small trading settlements evolved into fortified centers of power, providing the British with a stronghold from which to expand their influence across the subcontinent. This process was neither quick nor simple. It involved a careful blend of diplomacy, manipulation, and military strategy over several decades. After receiving the Royal Charter in 1600, the British East India Company's primary goal was to establish a strong commercial presence in India to engage in the lucrative spice trade and other valuable commodities such as cotton, silk, indigo, and saltpeter, used in gunpowder production. However, India was not an open field for trade. Other European powers, particularly the Portuguese and the Dutch, had already established themselves along the coastal regions of India. The British had to carefully navigate both the competitive European landscape and the complex political structures of Indian kingdoms and the declining Mughal Empire. The company's first significant breakthrough came in 1612, when the British won a crucial naval battle against the Portuguese near Surat. This victory not only weakened the Portuguese monopoly, but also caught the attention of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. Realizing the potential economic benefits of foreign trade, Jahangir granted the British permission to establish a permanent trading post in Surat, marking the beginning of their physical presence in India. Surat soon became a bustling hub for exporting Indian textiles to Europe, making it the company's first major foothold on Indian soil. Building on their success in Surat, the British expanded their presence along the Indian coastline. In 1639, the company acquired a small strip of land on the southeastern coast from a local ruler, which became the foundation for the city of Madras, modern-day Chennai. Here, they constructed Fort St. George, a fortified settlement that served not only as a trading post but also as a defensive outpost to protect British interests. This marked the company's first major fortified base in India, providing security against rival European powers and local rulers. Fort St. George became the center of the Madras Presidency, one of the three main administrative regions through which the British would eventually govern large parts of India. The company's ambitions did not stop on the southeastern coast. In 1668, the British East India Company acquired the islands of Bombay, modern-day Mumbai, from King Charles II of England, who had received them as part of his marriage dowry from the Portuguese. Recognizing the strategic and economic potential of Bombay's natural harbor, the company transformed these islands into a major trading and naval base. Over time, Bombay became the heart of the Bombay Presidency, another key administrative region under British control. The company invested heavily in fortifying the area, constructing Fort George to protect their growing commercial interests and to serve as a military stronghold. The final piece of the puzzle was Calcutta, modern-day Kolkata, on the eastern coast. In 1690, the British secured permission from the local ruler to establish a trading post on the banks of the Hooghly River. By 1696, they had begun the construction of Fort William, a large fortification designed to safeguard their trading operations. Calcutta rapidly grew into a major commercial hub and became the capital of the Bengal Presidency, the third and most economically significant administrative division controlled by the British East India Company. The city's strategic location on the eastern seaboard allowed the British to control trade routes leading into the fertile and prosperous regions of Bengal. The development of these three presidencies, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta, was not merely about commerce. Each trading post was heavily fortified, symbolizing the increasing militarization of the East India Company. These forts were designed to protect British trade interests, but they also allowed the company to exert pressure on local rulers and to defend against European rivals like the French and the Dutch. Over time, these settlements evolved from simple warehouses for storing goods into political and military centers that would become the launching points for further British expansion. The British also adopted a dual approach in managing their trading posts. On one hand, they portrayed themselves as peaceful merchants committed to fair trade and cooperation with local rulers. On the other hand, they maintained well-armed garrisons and naval forces capable of defending their interests and intimidating any opposition. This combination of diplomacy and military power allowed the British to gradually expand their territorial holdings without directly challenging the authority of major Indian powers, at least in the beginning. Another factor that worked in the British favor was their superior organizational efficiency. The East India Company's governance of these trading posts was structured and disciplined, with clear lines of authority and a well-developed system for managing trade, revenue collection, and military operations. This efficiency allowed them to outmaneuver and outlast many of their European rivals, who were often hampered by bureaucratic inefficiency or internal conflict. Furthermore, the trading posts became centers for cultural and technological exchange. British engineers introduced advanced fortifications, Western military tactics, and administrative methods that gave them a significant advantage over their Indian counterparts. At the same time, these settlements allowed the British to deepen their understanding of local cultures, economies, and political structures, knowledge that would later be used to manipulate and control Indian rulers. The strategic location of these three presidencies allowed the British to dominate key trade routes and shipping lanes. From Madras, they could control trade with Southeast Asia. From Bombay, they could oversee maritime routes to the Persian Gulf and East Africa, and from Calcutta, they could manage the rich trade of the Bengal region and beyond. This geographic spread enabled the British to establish a near monopoly on several critical goods and to systematically undermine local competitors and European rivals. By the early 18th century, these trading posts were no longer just commercial ventures. They had become the power centers of British influence in India. The British East India Company, initially just one of several European trading organizations operating in the region, had transformed itself into a dominant political and military force. The foundation laid by these trading posts would serve as the springboard for the British conquest of vast territories, marking the beginning of nearly 2 centuries of colonial rule. The weakening of the Mughal Empire was one of the most significant factors that allowed the British East India Company to expand its influence and eventually take control of India. For nearly 2 centuries, the Mughal Empire had been a symbol of political and cultural dominance across the Indian subcontinent. At its height in the late 17th century, the empire covered almost the entire Indian subcontinent, from Afghanistan in the west to Bengal in the east and down to the southern Deccan region. The Mughals maintained a vast and efficient administrative system, a powerful military, and an economy that was one of the most prosperous in the world. However, by the early 18th century, the empire began to unravel due to a combination of internal and external pressures. This decline created a power vacuum that the British were quick to exploit. One of the most critical turning points was the reign of Aurangzeb, 1658 to 1707, the last of the great Mughals. Aurangzeb expanded the empire to its largest territorial extent, but his aggressive policies laid the foundation for future instability. His long military campaigns in the Deccan drained the empire's treasury and overextended its resources. These campaigns not only weakened the central administration but also alienated many local rulers and communities. Aurangzeb's religious intolerance, including the imposition of the jizya tax on non-Muslims, further alienated large segments of the population, leading to widespread resentment and rebellion. After Aurangzeb's death in 1707, the empire descended into chaos. His successors, known as the later Mughals, were weak and ineffective rulers who struggled to maintain control over the vast empire. This period was marked by a series of succession crises as rival princes and nobles fought for the throne. Each new ruler was often installed or removed by powerful factions within the court, leading to political fragmentation. Without a strong central authority, local governors or subahtars and military commanders began to assert their independence. This disintegration of central power allowed regional kingdoms such as the Marathas, Rajputs, and Sikhs to rise and challenge Mughal authority. One of the most significant blows to the Mughal Empire came in 1739 when the Persian ruler Nadir Shah invaded Delhi. The city was brutally sacked, and the empire's wealth, including the famous Peacock Throne, was carried away to Persia. This devastating invasion exposed the empire's vulnerability and shattered its image of invincibility. The empire's prestige was further damaged when the Afghan ruler Ahmad Shah Durrani launched a series of invasions in the mid-18th century, culminating in the Third Battle of Panipat, 1761, where the Marathas, who had filled the power vacuum left by the Mughals, were decisively defeated. These external invasions not only weakened the empire's military capacity, but also crippled its economy. Meanwhile, the weakening of the empire allowed regional powers to emerge and assert dominance. The Maratha Confederacy expanded across much of central and northern India, while the Nawabs of Bengal, Awadh, and Hyderabad declared de facto independence while still recognizing the Mughal emperor in name. These regional powers frequently fought against each other, creating a fragmented political landscape that the British East India Company skillfully exploited. The British adopted a policy of divide and rule, taking advantage of the internal rivalries and offering military support to one faction against another. The Mughal administration also suffered from economic decline. The long wars of Aurangzeb's reign, combined with the invasions of Nadir Shah and Ahmad Shah Durrani, severely depleted the empire's finances. Additionally, the rise of European trading companies disrupted traditional trade networks. The British East India Company, along with other European powers, controlled major ports and manipulated trade in their favor. This economic exploitation weakened local economies and eroded the financial base of the Mughal state. Furthermore, corruption and inefficiency crept into the administrative system, with local governors often pocketing tax revenues instead of remitting them to the imperial treasury. The decline of the Mughal Empire also led to a breakdown of law and order. As central authority weakened, banditry and lawlessness increased across the countryside. The absence of a strong and unified government made it difficult to maintain roads, protect trade routes, and ensure the safety of merchants. This disruption in trade provided the British East India Company with another opportunity. They offered protection and stability to local merchants, which increased their influence over economic affairs. The British also took advantage of the empire's declining military strength. The Mughal army, once one of the most powerful in the world, became outdated and ineffective. It relied heavily on traditional cavalry and elephants, while the British forces, trained in European military techniques, used modern firearms, disciplined infantry, and artillery. This technological and tactical superiority allowed the British to defeat much larger Indian armies in battle. For example, at the Battle of Plassey, 1757, the British under Robert Clive defeated the Nawab of Bengal, largely because of superior military tactics and internal treachery within the Nawab's court. The political fragmentation caused by the weakening of the Mughal Empire also allowed the British to establish alliances with local rulers who sought their support against rivals. The British East India Company positioned itself as a neutral and reliable power broker, offering military aid in exchange for trade privileges and territorial concessions. This strategy was formalized through the subsidiary alliance system, which required Indian rulers to accept British protection and station British troops within their territories. In return, the rulers became dependent on the British for their survival, further eroding any chance of an independent Indian political structure. By the late 18th century, the Mughal emperor had become little more than a figurehead. The real political power rested with the British East India Company, which controlled vast territories through a combination of military dominance, economic manipulation, and strategic alliances. Even though the Mughal court remained in Delhi, its influence over the broader subcontinent was negligible. This symbolic authority allowed the British to legitimize their actions while gradually eliminating any remaining vestiges of Mughal power. The weakening of the Mughal Empire was not a sudden collapse, but a slow and multifaceted decline that unfolded over several decades. Internal decay, external invasions, economic hardships, and administrative inefficiency all contributed to the empire's fall. This gradual erosion of power provided the British East India Company with the opportunity to move beyond its original role as a trading entity and establish itself as the dominant political and military force in India. The Battle of Plassey, fought on June 23, 1757, was a pivotal event in Indian history that marked the beginning of British political dominance in India. This battle was not just a military confrontation, it was the result of years of political intrigue, manipulation, and the strategic ambitions of the British East India Company. The victory at Plassey allowed the company to establish itself as the dominant power in Bengal, the wealthiest region of India at the time, and set the stage for the eventual colonization of the entire Indian subcontinent. The conflict at Plassey arose from a struggle for power between Siraj-ud-Daulah, the Nawab of Bengal, and the British East India Company. Siraj-ud-Daulah had become the Nawab in 1756 at the young age of 23, succeeding his grandfather, Alivardi Khan. His ascension to power was met with resistance from rival factions within his own court, who viewed him as inexperienced and impetuous. At the same time, the British East India Company was expanding its influence in Bengal through trade, fortifications, and increasing military power. This growing British presence was seen as a threat to the Nawab's authority. One of the immediate causes of conflict was the fortification of Fort William in Calcutta by the British without the Nawab's permission. Siraj-ud-Daulah viewed this move as a direct challenge to his sovereignty. In June 1756, he marched on Calcutta with a large army and captured the city. This event led to the infamous Black Hole of Calcutta incident, where a group of British prisoners were allegedly confined in a small, airless dungeon overnight, resulting in the deaths of several prisoners due to suffocation. While the accuracy of the incident remains debated, it became a rallying point for British retaliation and increased public support in Britain for military action in India. In response, the British East India Company sent Robert Clive, a former clerk who had become a skilled military strategist, to Bengal to recapture Calcutta and assert British authority. By January 1757, Clive had successfully retaken the city and began planning further action to unseat Siraj-ud-Daulah. However, Clive recognized that military force alone would not be enough. He needed to weaken the Nawab from within. Clive began secret negotiations with discontented factions in the Nawab's court. One of the most critical figures in this plot was Mir Jafar, the Nawab's commander-in-chief. Mir Jafar, along with a group of influential courtiers and bankers, most notably Jugat Seth, a wealthy financier, sought to overthrow Siraj-ud-Daulah due to his erratic leadership and policies that threatened their economic interests. In exchange for British support, Clive promised to install Mir Jafar as the next Nawab of Bengal. On June 23, 1757, the two sides met on the Plassey Plains, located near the Bhagirathi River. Siraj-ud-Daulah commanded an army of approximately 50,000 soldiers, including infantry, cavalry, and artillery supplied by the French. In contrast, Clive's forces were much smaller, about 3,000 soldiers, including British troops and Indian sepoys. Despite being outnumbered, the British had a crucial advantage. Mir Jafar and a significant portion of the Nawab's army were secretly aligned with them. As the battle began, the Nawab's forces initially appeared to have the upper hand. However, Clive's forces were better trained, disciplined, and equipped with superior artillery. Moreover, monsoon rains disrupted the Nawab's advance, dampening their gunpowder and rendering much of their artillery ineffective. Crucially, Mir Jafar and other commanders withheld their troops from engaging in the battle, leaving Siraj-ud-Daulah vulnerable. This betrayal turned the tide in favor of the British. By the afternoon, Siraj-ud-Daulah's forces were in disarray, and he fled the battlefield. The British emerged victorious with minimal casualties, while the Nawab's army was decisively defeated. In the aftermath, Siraj-ud-Daulah was captured and executed by Mir Jafar's supporters, clearing the way for Clive to install Mir Jafar as a puppet ruler under British control. The consequences of the Battle of Plassey were profound and far-reaching. With Mir Jafar as the new Nawab, the British East India Company gained political control over Bengal and access to its immense wealth. This victory allowed the company to extract massive amounts of revenue, which funded further military campaigns and expanded their influence in other regions of India. Bengal's rich agricultural production, lucrative textile industry, and strategic ports became vital assets for the British Empire. Economically, the victory at Plassey marked the beginning of British economic exploitation in India. Under Mir Jafar's rule, the company imposed heavy financial demands, including a payment of 17 million rupees as compensation for the cost of the war. This wealth not only strengthened the company's position in India but also enhanced its influence in Britain, where shareholders and politicians reaped the benefits of this colonial windfall. Politically, the battle established a new form of governance, where the British East India Company controlled local rulers while maintaining the facade of native authority. Mir Jafar soon became disillusioned with his lack of real power and attempted to resist British interference. In response, the company replaced him with his son-in-law, Mir Qasim, who later also rebelled, leading to the Battle of Buxar, 1764. Another significant British victory that further cemented their dominance. The Battle of Plassey also demonstrated the effectiveness of the British strategy of divide and rule. By exploiting internal rivalries and using a combination of military force and political manipulation, the British were able to control large territories without deploying massive armies. This strategy would become a hallmark of British colonial policy across India in the years to come. Furthermore, the victory shifted the balance of power between European powers in India. The French, who had supported Siraj-ud-Daulah, suffered a significant setback and were gradually marginalized in Indian affairs. The British East India Company became the preeminent European force in India, free to expand its influence without serious competition. In conclusion, the Battle of Plassey was far more than a simple military encounter. It was a turning point that transformed the British East India Company from a commercial trading enterprise into a territorial power. This battle laid the foundation for almost 200 years of British rule in India, reshaping the political, economic, and social landscape of the subcontinent. The Battle of Buxar, fought on October 22, 1764, was a decisive confrontation between the British East India Company and a coalition of Indian rulers. This battle was far more significant than just a military victory. It solidified the company's control over Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, paving the way for British dominance in India. It marked the culmination of years of political maneuvering, economic exploitation, and the weakening of local powers. The outcome fundamentally changed the relationship between the British and Indian rulers, transforming the East India Company from a trading enterprise into a major governing authority. Background and causes of the battle. After the Battle of Plassey, 1757, the British East India Company had established significant influence over Bengal by installing Mir Jafar as the puppet Nawab. However, Mir Jafar's dissatisfaction with being a figurehead and the growing greed of the company soon created tensions. The British demanded increasing sums of money, which drained the Nawab's treasury. In 1760, the company, dissatisfied with Mir Jafar's resistance, deposed him and replaced him with his son-in-law, Mir Qasim. Mir Qasim initially cooperated with the British and implemented administrative reforms to improve the governance of Bengal. However, he soon grew resentful of British interference and their exploitative trade policies. One major source of conflict was the abolition of internal duties for British merchants while Indian traders continued to pay heavy taxes. This unfair advantage devastated local businesses and deprived the Nawab of significant revenue. When Mir Qasim attempted to reassert his independence and curb the company's commercial privileges, tensions escalated into open conflict. By 1763, Mir Qasim had allied with two powerful rulers to resist British domination, Shah Alam II, the Mughal emperor, who sought to restore Mughal authority, and Shuja-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab of Awadh, who feared British encroachment on his territory. Together, they formed a formidable coalition to drive the British out of northern India and restore Indian sovereignty. The battle and its course. The Battle of Buxar took place near the modern town of Buxar in Bihar. The combined forces of Mir Qasim, Shah Alam II, and Shuja-ud-Dowlah numbered approximately 40,000 soldiers, consisting of infantry, cavalry, and artillery. In contrast, the British East India Company fielded a smaller but better disciplined and better equipped force of around 7,000 troops, led by Major Hector Munro. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the British had a distinct advantage in terms of military organization, superior European-style training, and advanced artillery. The battle itself was marked by poor coordination among the Indian allies. Although they had a numerical advantage, their forces lacked unity and a coherent strategy. The British, on the other hand, operated under a centralized command and executed their battle plan with precision. Major Hector Munro employed linear formations and superior artillery firepower, which allowed the British forces to inflict heavy casualties while maintaining their defensive positions. Mir Qasim, disillusioned by the disloyalty of his own officers and the chaos on the battlefield, eventually fled to Rohilkhand. Shah Alam II and Shuja-ud-Dowlah continued the fight, but were eventually overwhelmed by the disciplined and relentless British forces. By the end of the day, the Indian coalition was decisively defeated, with thousands of their troops killed or captured, while British casualties remained comparatively low. Aftermath and consequences. The Battle of Buxar had far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond the immediate military outcome. It marked a turning point where the British East India Company transitioned from a regional power to the de facto ruler of large territories in India. Some of the most significant outcomes include Treaty of Allahabad, 1765. In the aftermath of their victory, the British imposed the Treaty of Allahabad on the defeated rulers. Under this agreement, Shuja-ud-Dowlah was allowed to retain his position as the Nawab of Awadh, but he had to pay a massive indemnity and accept British dominance. Awadh became a buffer state protecting British interests from potential external invasions. Shah Alam II, the Mughal emperor, became a pensioner of the British East India Company. Although he nominally remained the ruler of the Mughal Empire, his authority was effectively reduced to a ceremonial role. The British East India Company gained Diwani rights, the authority to collect revenue and administer the provinces of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This gave the company control over vast economic resources and formalized their dominance in the region. Economic control and exploitation. The grant of Diwani marked a profound shift in power. For the first time, a foreign company gained the legal right to collect taxes from millions of Indian subjects. This revenue funded further British military campaigns, expanded their administrative infrastructure, and allowed them to remit enormous wealth back to Britain. Meanwhile, Bengal's economy suffered under the weight of heavy taxation and mismanagement. The agricultural sector faced ruin, leading to severe famines such as the Great Bengal Famine of 1770, which killed millions. Weakening of Indian rulers. The battle shattered the independence of powerful Indian rulers. Shujayuddin-Daullah's survival depended on British favor, and the Mughal emperor became a puppet under their protection. The weakening of these central figures allowed the British to divide and conquer other regional powers, eventually bringing most of India under their rule. Military and administrative changes. The victory at Buxar demonstrated the superiority of British military tactics and discipline. This success led to the reorganization and expansion of the East India Company's military, including the recruitment of more sepoys, Indian soldiers trained in European methods. The battle also accelerated the development of a more formal administrative system, which laid the foundation for British governance in India. Foundation of the British Empire in India. The Battle of Buxar was the final blow to any serious challenge to British authority in eastern and northern India. With Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa firmly under their control, the British East India Company became the most powerful political and military force on the subcontinent. This victory paved the way for the subsequent expansion of British territory and the eventual establishment of direct crown rule after 1858. Strategic significance. The battle also had profound implications for the broader geopolitical landscape. By securing control over Bengal's revenue and resources, the British East India Company gained the financial and military power to repel European rivals, especially the French, and extend their influence into other parts of India. Furthermore, the success at Buxar strengthened the company's position in British politics, as the enormous wealth extracted from India enriched the company's shareholders and influential figures in the British government. In many ways, the Battle of Buxar was a defining moment in India's colonial history, marking the beginning of systematic economic exploitation and political subjugation under British rule. This victory allowed the East India Company to transcend its commercial origins and become the architect of the British Empire in the Indian subcontinent. The divide and rule policy was one of the most powerful and effective strategies used by the British East India Company and later the British Crown to establish and maintain control over India. This policy was not just a military tactic, but a sophisticated political strategy that exploited existing divisions among Indian rulers, communities, and social groups. By fostering disunity, the British were able to weaken collective resistance, manipulate rivalries, and consolidate their dominance over the vast and diverse Indian subcontinent. Origins of divide and rule policy. The roots of the divide and rule strategy can be traced back to the period after the Battle of Plassey, 1757, and the Battle of Buxar, 1764, when the British East India Company transformed from a mere trading enterprise into a political and military power. The British quickly recognized that India's vast territory, cultural diversity, and fragmented political landscape made it difficult for any single ruler to exercise absolute authority. The decline of the Mughal Empire had already created a power vacuum, leading to the rise of several regional powers, such as the Marathas, Rajputs, Sikhs, and Nawabs, who were constantly competing against one another. The British exploited these internal rivalries to gradually expand their influence without having to fight large-scale wars continuously. The policy evolved over time, becoming a deliberate strategy by the early 19th century, as the British realized that maintaining control over such a large and culturally complex territory required the systematic fragmentation of Indian society. How the divide and rule policy worked. The divide and rule policy operated on multiple levels: political, social, religious, and economic, and was carefully implemented through a combination of diplomacy, manipulation, and force. Some of the main techniques included exploiting political rivalries. The British capitalized on the disunity between Indian rulers by playing one ruler against another. After the Battle of Buxar, for example, the British established treaties with various Indian princes, ensuring that they remained dependent on British military protection while preventing any alliance against British power. Through the subsidiary alliance system introduced by Lord Wellesley in the early 1800s, the British compelled Indian rulers to maintain British troops within their territories while relinquishing their ability to form independent foreign policies. This made the rulers effectively vassals of the company. The British used this policy against the Maratha Confederacy, which had become a powerful force in western and central India. By fostering internal conflicts among Maratha leaders, such as the Peshwas, Scindias, and Holkars, the British weakened the Confederacy and eventually defeated them in a series of Anglo-Maratha Wars, 1775 to 1818. Similarly, they used the policy to weaken the Sikh Empire after Maharaja Ranjit Singh's death, turning Sikh factions against one another, which ultimately led to the defeat of the Sikhs in the Anglo-Sikh Wars, 1845 to 1849. Dividing religious communities. A crucial part of the divide and rule strategy was to foster sectarian divisions, especially between Hindus and Muslims. Although India had a long history of religious coexistence, the British implemented policies that exaggerated religious differences. They encouraged the formation of separate identities, which led to tensions between the two communities. One significant example was the 1857 revolt, also known as the First War of Indian Independence. During this rebellion, both Hindus and Muslims united against the British. In response, the British intensified their divide and rule policy after suppressing the revolt. They promoted the notion that the rebellion was a Muslim conspiracy, while simultaneously depicting Hindus as being more loyal to British rule. This deliberate framing sowed seeds of mistrust between the two communities. By the late 19th century, the British implemented measures that institutionalized communal divisions. For example, the Indian Councils Act of 1909, also called the Morley-Minto Reforms, introduced separate electorates for Hindus and Muslims, allowing Muslims to elect their own representatives. This move deepened the rift between the two communities and weakened the possibility of a united nationalist movement against British rule. Manipulating social hierarchies. The British also exploited caste divisions in Indian society to prevent any collective uprising. Traditional caste hierarchies had existed in India for centuries, but the British systematized and rigidified these divisions through their census surveys and legal classifications. By documenting and defining caste identities, the British fostered a sense of separation between different social groups. They offered privileges and administrative positions to certain castes while marginalizing others, creating resentment and competition. This policy discouraged cross-caste alliances and allowed the British to maintain control over a divided population. Economic fragmentation. Economically, the British implemented land revenue systems like the Permanent Settlement of Bengal, 1793, and the Rayatwari and Mahalwari systems. These policies disrupted traditional land ownership patterns, turning landlords, zamindars, into intermediaries who were loyal to British interests. By favoring certain landowners over others, the British deepened class divisions and weakened rural solidarity. Additionally, they encouraged economic rivalries between different regions. For example, Bengal's traditional textile industry was undermined in favor of British manufactured goods, while certain areas of southern India were promoted as suppliers of raw materials. This unequal economic development fostered regional rivalries and hindered the formation of a unified national economy. Undermining nationalist movements. As the Indian independence movement began to emerge in the late 19th century, the British applied the divide and rule strategy to weaken nationalist unity. They portrayed groups like the Indian National Congress as representing Hindu interests, while simultaneously encouraging the formation of Muslim political organizations like the All India Muslim League, founded in 1906. By granting political concessions to one community while denying them to others, the British sowed discord within the nationalist movement. This division became increasingly pronounced in the 1930s and 1940s, eventually contributing to the tragic partition of India in 1947, when the subcontinent was divided into India and Pakistan along religious lines. Impact of the divide and rule policy. The divide and rule policy had far-reaching and devastating consequences for India. Prolonged British rule. By exploiting internal divisions, the British managed to maintain their authority over India for nearly 200 years without needing to maintain a massive military force. Social fragmentation. The policy deepened caste, religious, and regional divisions, many of which continue to affect Indian society today. Delayed national unity. The policy hindered the development of a unified national identity, making it difficult for Indian leaders to mobilize a broad-based movement against colonial rule. Partition of India. The most tragic outcome of this policy was the partition in 1947, which led to widespread violence, the displacement of millions, and the creation of two separate nations, India and Pakistan. By systematically dividing Indian society across political, religious, and social lines, the British East India Company, and later the British Crown, ensured that no single power could effectively challenge their control over the subcontinent. The subsidiary alliance system was a key strategy used by the British East India Company to expand and consolidate its control over India. This system, introduced by Lord Wellesley, the Governor-General of India from 1798 to 1805, was designed to bring Indian princely states under British dominance without direct annexation. Through this clever and coercive arrangement, the British reduced independent rulers to vassals while maintaining the appearance of their sovereignty. This policy played a critical role in transforming the East India Company from a trading corporation into the de facto ruler of vast parts of India. Origins of the subsidiary alliance system. By the late 18th century, the British East India Company had become a significant political and military power in India. However, competition from other European powers, particularly the French, posed a constant threat to British interests. Additionally, several powerful Indian states, such as the Marathas, Mysore, and the Nizam of Hyderabad, sought to challenge British dominance. In response to these threats, Lord Wellesley devised the subsidiary alliance system as a means to extend British control without the costs and risks of outright military conquest. The system allowed the company to station British troops within the territories of allied Indian states under the pretext of providing military protection. In reality, it stripped these rulers of their independence while allowing the British to dominate their internal and external affairs. Key features of the subsidiary alliance system. The subsidiary alliance was a carefully crafted policy that allowed the British to exert indirect control over Indian rulers. Its main conditions were stationing of British troops. Indian rulers who entered into a subsidiary alliance were required to accept and maintain a permanent contingent of British troops within their territories. This military force was ostensibly for their protection against external enemies, but in reality, it ensured that the British could intervene in the ruler's affairs whenever they chose. Payment for the British Army. The allied Indian state had to bear the financial burden of maintaining the British military presence. If a ruler could not pay the required amount, the British would often take territorial concessions in lieu of payment. This placed a heavy economic strain on Indian states, making them financially dependent on the British. No alliances with other powers. Indian rulers who entered into a subsidiary alliance were forbidden from forming any treaties, diplomatic relations, or military alliances with other foreign powers without British permission. This effectively ended their ability to conduct independent foreign policy and made them reliant on the British for their external security. British resident. A British resident, a political agent, was stationed at the court of the allied ruler. While the ruler retained their title and ceremonial authority, the resident acted as the real power behind the throne. The resident monitored the state's administration and ensured that British interests were upheld. Loss of sovereignty. Although rulers under the subsidiary alliance were technically independent, their actual power was significantly curtailed. They could no longer maintain their own independent military forces and had to accept British interference in their internal matters. Over time, many Indian princes became mere puppets under British control. Implementation of the subsidiary alliance system. Lord Wellesley aggressively pursued the subsidiary alliance policy to subjugate major Indian powers. Some of the most significant alliances included Hyderabad, 1798. The Nizam of Hyderabad was the first Indian ruler to sign a subsidiary alliance in 1798. Fearing attacks from the Marathas and Tipu Sultan of Mysore, the Nizam sought British protection. Under the terms of the alliance, the British stationed their forces in Hyderabad and the Nizam had to pay for their maintenance. This effectively turned Hyderabad into a British protectorate. Mysore, 1799. After the defeat of Tipu Sultan in the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War, 1799, his kingdom was brought under British influence. The British restored a portion of the territory to the Wadiyar dynasty under the condition that they accept a subsidiary alliance. This ended Mysore's role as a major power in southern India. Awadh, 1801. The Nawab of Awadh signed a subsidiary alliance in 1801 under heavy pressure. Awadh was a wealthy kingdom, and the British coveted its resources. In return for military protection, the Nawab had to cede a large portion of his territory, including Rohilkhand and the Doab region. This marked the beginning of Awadh's decline and eventual annexation in 1856. Marathas, 1802. The British used the subsidiary alliance to divide and weaken the Maratha Confederacy. After the Second Anglo-Maratha War, 1803 to 1805, various Maratha leaders, including the Peshwa Baji Rao II, were forced to accept British protection. This shattered Maratha unity and allowed the British to dominate central India, Tanjore, Surat, and other small states. Several smaller states like Tanjore, Surat, and Baroda also fell under the subsidiary alliance. These minor rulers, unable to resist British pressure, surrendered their independence and became mere vassals of the company. Impact of the subsidiary alliance system. The subsidiary alliance system had profound and far-reaching effects on Indian politics, economy, and society. Expansion of British territory. By forcing Indian rulers to accept British protection, the East India Company extended its territorial control without direct conquest. The system allowed the British to dominate the Deccan, Awadh, and central India, paving the way for the complete subjugation of the subcontinent. Loss of Indian sovereignty. Indian rulers who entered into these alliances lost their independence in all but name. Their military and foreign policy decisions were controlled by the British, and they became mere figureheads in their own kingdoms. Economic exploitation. The financial burden of maintaining British troops drained the treasuries of Allied states. This weakened local economies, increased taxation on the common people, and caused widespread poverty. If rulers defaulted on payments, they were forced to surrender territories, leading to a gradual annexation of their lands. Political fragmentation. The system deepened divisions between Indian rulers, preventing any unified resistance against British expansion. By isolating and controlling individual kingdoms, the British systematically dismantled powerful regional forces like the Marathas and the Nizam's government. Administrative control. The appointment of British residents gave the East India Company direct oversight over the administration of Allied states. This allowed them to interfere in internal matters, weaken indigenous governance, and impose British laws and economic practices, paving the way for British rule. The subsidiary alliance was a stepping stone toward direct British rule in India. By reducing independent kingdoms to dependent protectorates, the British laid the foundation for the formal establishment of the British Raj in 1858, when the East India Company's control was transferred to the British Crown. Weakening of Indian resistance. The system not only isolated powerful states, but also eroded their military strength. Without independent armies, Indian rulers became defenseless against British policies and were unable to mobilize effective opposition. The subsidiary alliance system was a masterstroke of imperial strategy, allowing the British to dominate India without the need for constant warfare. Through a combination of diplomacy, coercion, and manipulation, the system reduced proud and independent Indian kingdoms to client states, firmly establishing British supremacy over the subcontinent. The doctrine of lapse was a highly controversial and aggressive policy introduced by Lord Dalhousie, who served as the Governor-General of India from 1848 to 1856. This policy became one of the most effective tools for the British East India Company to annex Indian states and expand their empire. It directly challenged the age-old traditions of Indian succession and allowed the British to seize control of princely states under specific conditions. The doctrine of lapse played a significant role in accelerating the disintegration of independent Indian kingdoms and furthering British dominance over the subcontinent. Origins of the doctrine of lapse. The doctrine of lapse was rooted in the British East India Company's ambition to extend its territorial control. According to Hindu and Muslim customs in many Indian states, if a ruler died without a biological heir, he could adopt a son to continue the family lineage and succeed him as the ruler. This tradition ensured the continuity of the dynasty and the preservation of political stability. However, under Lord Dalhousie's administration, the British refused to recognize the legitimacy of adopted heirs. According to the doctrine of lapse, if a ruler of a princely state died without a natural, biological, male heir, the territory would lapse or revert to the British East India Company. This policy denied Indian rulers the right to adopt an heir without the British government's explicit approval, thereby giving the British a legal pretext to annex kingdoms. Although Dalhousie framed the doctrine of lapse as an administrative measure to prevent disorder and ensure good governance, its actual objective was to expand British territories and dismantle independent Indian states. Key principles of the doctrine of lapse. The doctrine of lapse was based on several fundamental principles that empowered the British to annex Indian states. Denial of adoption rights. Indian rulers could no longer adopt an heir without the formal permission of the British East India Company. If a ruler died without an approved biological successor, the territory would automatically become a part of the company's dominion. Annexation of territories. If a state lapsed under this policy, it was annexed by the British and brought under direct administration. The native royal family would lose all political authority, and their kingdom would become part of British India. Application to dependent states. The doctrine of lapse was applied not only to independent princely states, but also to those already under British protection through treaties. Even allied rulers who had pledged loyalty to the British could lose their territories if they failed to produce a biological male heir. No recognition of customary laws. Indian customs and traditions regarding adoption and succession were completely disregarded. The British legal system took precedence over centuries-old indigenous practices. Implementation of the doctrine of lapse. Lord Dalhousie applied the doctrine of lapse with uncompromising rigor, resulting in the annexation of several prosperous and historically significant Indian states. Some of the most prominent cases include Satara, 1848. The Kingdom of Satara was the first major state to be annexed under the doctrine of lapse. Its ruler, Appa Sahib, died without a biological heir, and despite the presence of an adopted successor, the British refused to recognize him. This annexation was a turning point, setting a precedent for future applications of the policy. Jaitpur and Sambalpur, 1849. Both Jaitpur and Sambalpur were annexed under similar circumstances. These small but strategically located regions were brought under British control after their rulers died, without natural heirs. Baghat, 1850. The small kingdom of Baghat faced the same fate as the British applied the doctrine of lapse to extend their influence into the Himalayan foothills. Udaipur, 1852. When the ruler of Udaipur died without a direct heir, the British swiftly moved to annex the kingdom, further consolidating their hold over central India. Jhansi, 1853. One of the most famous and contentious applications of the doctrine of lapse was the annexation of Jhansi. After the death of Raja Gangadhar Rao, his widow, Rani Lakshmibai, adopted a son as heir. However, the British refused to acknowledge the adoption, leading to the forcible annexation of Jhansi. This event became a powerful symbol of oppression and was a major catalyst for Rani Lakshmibai's participation in the 1857 revolt. Nagpur, 1854. The princely state of Nagpur was another significant victim of the doctrine of lapse. After the death of Raghojee III, the British refused to accept his adopted successor, leading to the annexation of this large and economically vital region. These annexations brought vast tracts of land under British control, enabling them to strengthen their political grip and extract more economic resources. Impact of the doctrine of lapse. The doctrine of lapse had far-reaching and profound consequences on Indian society, politics, and culture. Expansion of British territory. Through the doctrine of lapse, the British East India Company expanded its dominion without waging major wars. This policy enabled the British to annex large, resource-rich regions, including Jhansi and Nagpur, significantly increasing their territorial expanse. Loss of Indian sovereignty. The policy systematically eroded the independence of Indian rulers. Kings and princes who had previously governed their states for generations lost all political authority, leaving them powerless under British administration. Political discontent. The arbitrary and aggressive implementation of the doctrine of lapse generated widespread resentment among Indian rulers and their subjects. Many Indian elites saw this policy as a deliberate attempt to humiliate and destroy their cultural and political heritage. Political discontent. The arbitrary and aggressive implementation of the doctrine of lapse generated widespread resentment among Indian rulers and their subjects. Many Indian elites saw this policy as a deliberate attempt to humiliate and destroy their cultural and political heritage. Economic exploitation. Once annexed, these territories were subjected to the British economic system, which prioritized revenue extraction. Traditional economies were disrupted, and the local population faced heavy taxation and economic hardship. Cultural and social impact. The policy disregarded the customary laws and religious traditions of adoption and succession, which had been deeply ingrained in Indian society. This was viewed as an assault on Indian identity and cultural autonomy. Fueling the revolt of 1857. The doctrine of lapse was one of the key factors leading to the Indian Revolt of 1857. The forced annexations, especially that of Jhansi, created deep anger among dispossessed rulers and their followers. Rani Lakshmibai became a symbol of resistance, leading her forces against the British during the uprising. The policy contributed to the perception that the British were not only foreign oppressors, but also destroyers of Indian traditions. Administrative challenges. While the doctrine of lapse helped the British expand their empire, it also created significant administrative burdens. The newly annexed regions required extensive bureaucratic oversight, and the British had to establish new systems of governance to manage these territories. The doctrine of lapse was more than just a policy of annexation. It was a calculated and ruthless instrument of imperial expansion that dismantled centuries of Indian sovereignty and left a lasting legacy of discontent and resistance. One of the most significant and lasting impacts of British rule in India was the extensive economic exploitation that systematically drained the subcontinent's wealth while enriching Britain. From the arrival of the British East India Company as a trading enterprise to the establishment of direct British control, the Indian economy was reshaped to serve British interests. This transformation was not a natural evolution, but a deliberate policy aimed at extracting maximum revenue, controlling trade, and weakening local industries. The British economic policies were designed to turn India into a supplier of raw materials and a market for British manufactured goods. This exploitative relationship caused severe damage to India's traditional economy, disrupted local industries, and led to widespread poverty and famine. Let us examine the different ways in which the British used economic exploitation as a means to establish and maintain their dominance in India. 1. The drain of wealth. One of the most devastating aspects of British economic exploitation was the drain of wealth, a term first popularized by Dadabhai Naoroji in the 19th century. It referred to the systematic transfer of wealth from India to Britain without any significant return. This drain took place through various mechanisms. Excessive taxation. The British imposed heavy land taxes on Indian farmers, often extracting as much as 50% of agricultural produce. This tax revenue was used to finance British administrative costs and military expansion. Indian peasants were left impoverished, struggling under crushing debts and frequently losing their lands. Export of surplus. India was forced to export valuable raw materials such as cotton, indigo, jute, and opium to Britain at low prices, while importing expensive finished goods. This unfavorable trade balance drained India's resources and widened economic inequality. Home charges. A substantial part of Indian revenue, known as home charges, was sent to Britain to cover the cost of governing India, paying British officials and repaying loans. This financial burden depleted India's treasury, while sustaining Britain's industrial growth. 2. Destruction of indigenous industries. Before British intervention, India had a flourishing economy with thriving handicrafts, textile production, and metalwork. Indian textiles, in particular, were famous worldwide for their quality and craftsmanship. However, the British pursued a deliberate policy to cripple these industries to eliminate competition for British manufacturers. Deindustrialization. Indian artisans and craftsmen were systematically displaced by the influx of machine-made British goods. For example, the traditional Indian textile industry was devastated as British mills flooded the Indian market with cheaper cloth. This led to mass unemployment and the decline of entire artisan communities. Unfair trade policies. The British imposed high tariffs on Indian-made goods exported to Britain while allowing duty-free entry of British goods into India. This ensured that Indian products could not compete with cheaper British imports. Loss of livelihoods. Artisans and weavers who had been the backbone of India's economy were left destitute. Many were forced to abandon their crafts and turn to agriculture, further increasing pressure on the already overburdened rural economy. 3. Land revenue systems and agricultural exploitation. The British introduced exploitative land revenue systems that fundamentally altered rural India. These systems prioritized revenue collection over the welfare of farmers, causing economic hardship and frequent famines. Permanent settlement, 1793, introduced by Lord Cornwallis in Bengal. This system made zamindars, landlords, the owners of the land. In return, they had to pay a fixed amount of tax to the British government. This led to widespread exploitation as zamindars squeezed tenants for more rent while paying the British a fixed sum. Ryotwari system. Implemented in Madras and Bombay, this system made individual farmers directly responsible for paying land revenue. It placed a heavy financial burden on peasants, especially when harvests failed or market prices declined. Mahalwari system. Introduced in northwestern India, this system held entire villages responsible for paying taxes. While it seemed collective in nature, it still subjected farmers to unpredictable tax burdens. These harsh systems left farmers vulnerable to debt, displacement, and famine. The pressure to meet tax demands often forced farmers to sell their land, creating a class of landless laborers and enriching British officials. 4. Commercialization of agriculture. The British reoriented Indian agriculture to suit their economic interests, forcing farmers to shift from subsistence farming to cash crops required by British industries. Cash crops over food crops. Farmers were coerced into growing indigo, cotton, tea, and opium instead of staple food crops like wheat and rice. This shift increased export profits for the British, but caused severe food shortages for the Indian population. One of the most insidious and far-reaching strategies the British used to maintain and expand their control over India was the divide and rule policy. This tactic involved exploiting social, religious, regional, and caste-based differences within Indian society to prevent the emergence of a unified front against British authority. By fostering divisions among various groups, the British successfully weakened Indian resistance and prolonged their rule for nearly 2 centuries. This policy was not only a tool for maintaining power, but also a deliberate attempt to fragment Indian society and prevent the rise of nationalist movements. The divide and rule strategy was a calculated approach to pit different communities against one another, making it easier for the British to govern. The effects of this policy continue to shape the social and political landscape of India even today. Let us explore how this policy was implemented and how it affected Indian society. 1. Exploitation of religious differences. One of the most effective methods used by the British under the divide and rule policy was the deliberate manipulation of religious identities. India has historically been a multi-religious society, with significant populations of Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, and others coexisting for centuries. The British recognized these religious distinctions and exaggerated them to foster distrust and hostility. Separate religious identities. The British encouraged the development of separate religious identities through census classifications and legal frameworks. By institutionalizing religion in administrative policies, they intensified communal divisions. Communal representation. The introduction of separate electorates under the Indian Councils Act of 1909, also known as the Morley-Minto Reforms, gave different religious groups their own voting rights. This move was portrayed as a gesture to protect minority rights, but its real consequence was the creation of a political rift between communities. Favoritism and patronage. The British often played communities against each other by offering privileges to one group while suppressing another. For instance, after the 1857 revolt, Muslims were systematically disenfranchised and labeled as disloyal, while the British sought to cultivate better relations with Hindus. 2. Fragmentation along caste lines. The British also exploited the caste system to deepen social divisions. Although the caste system predated British rule, it became more rigid and institutionalized under colonial administration. Census and caste categories. Through the census of 1871, the British formally categorized and classified people based on caste. This administrative step heightened caste consciousness and increased social segregation. Legal codification. By incorporating caste distinctions into the legal and political framework, the British made it difficult for lower caste communities to challenge social hierarchies. Division of labor. The British reinforced occupational divisions by associating certain jobs with specific castes. This move entrenched the idea that social mobility was impossible, causing long-term damage to social cohesion. 3. Regional fragmentation. Another tactic the British used was to divide India regionally by fostering local rivalries and promoting provincial identities. This strategy prevented the growth of a pan-Indian identity and limited the spread of nationalist sentiment. Partition of Bengal, 1905, in one of the most blatant examples of divide and rule, Lord Curzon partitioned Bengal along religious lines, separating the Hindu-majority West Bengal from the Muslim-majority East Bengal. This move was justified as an administrative necessity, but was clearly intended to weaken the growing nationalist movement in Bengal. The partition sparked mass protests and was eventually reversed in 1911, but it left a legacy of communal discord. Princely states versus British India. By maintaining indirect rule over princely states while directly administering British India, the colonizers created a fragmented political landscape. This prevented unified opposition and allowed the British to play rulers against their people. 4. Disrupting nationalist unity. As Indian nationalism grew stronger in the late 19th century, the British became increasingly reliant on divide and rule to prevent a unified independence movement. Communal organizations. The British encouraged the creation of communal political organizations, such as the Muslim League in 1906. While the Indian National Congress advocated for secular unity, the British supported separate Muslim interests to undermine this vision. Encouraging political rivalries. The British fostered competition between different political groups, portraying Indian leaders as self-serving and divided. This narrative weakened public confidence in the ability of Indians to govern themselves. 5. Division in the military and bureaucracy. The British meticulously divided the Indian army and bureaucracy along ethnic and communal lines to prevent unified uprisings. Military recruitment policies. After the 1857 revolt, the British revised their recruitment policies to favor communities they considered loyal, such as Punjabis, Gurkhas, and Sikhs, while sidelining others like Bengalis and Muslims who had participated in the rebellion. Segregated bureaucracy. The civil administration was similarly divided. Indian officials were deliberately placed in junior positions, while British officers held real authority. Promotions were often granted based on ethnic loyalty rather than merit. 6. Use of media and propaganda. The British effectively used media and propaganda to spread the narrative that Indians were inherently divided and unable to govern themselves. Communal narratives. British-sponsored newspapers often highlighted communal tensions and sectarian conflicts, portraying these as natural rather than the result of colonial policies. Historical distortions. British historians emphasized conflicts between Hindus and Muslims to suggest that Indian society had always been divided and required British oversight to maintain order. 7. Legacy of divide and rule. The effects of the British divide and rule policy have had long-lasting consequences on post-colonial India. Communal violence. The seeds of religious conflict sown during British rule culminated in the Partition of India in 1947, which resulted in mass violence, displacement, and loss of life. Political fragmentation. Even after independence, India has struggled with regional separatism, caste-based politics, and communal strife, many of which can be traced back to the British divide and rule strategy. Weakened social unity. By systematically exploiting religious, regional, and caste divisions, the British left behind a fractured society where deep-rooted inequalities and mistrust persist. The divide and rule policy was not just a strategy for governance, it was a deliberate manipulation of India's social fabric, causing wounds that continue to affect the nation's political and social dynamics.